Welcome. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. And it's truly a pleasure for me to start our series for this fall, unfortunately virtually, because we were planning to invite Professor Khalili to Princeton for a longer visit and some workshops and seminars and conversations. But alas, we all are stuck with this kind of virtual conversations, which still is a privilege to have here. Let me just introduce Professor Laleh Khalili, who is now in London at Queen Mary University as a professor of international politics. I also have the privilege of being a friend of Professor Khalili, so if I refer to her as Laleh, so forgive me for that. We also share another thing because Professor Khalili has a degree in chemical engineering from University of Texas, Austin. So we share that because I also have a degree in engineering from Polytechnic University in Tehran. So this kind of engineering background, I don't know how it infiltrates our work, but it's there, and of course I never finished my degree and I never practiced it. So you're one step ahead of me there, Laleh.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me. And I am quite sad not to be able to get together in person and also meet some of the wonderful people affiliated with your center in Princeton in person. But it's lovely to be able to speak with you. And as for the engineering thing, I didn't really practice it either. I worked a couple of summers as a sort of an engineering intern, but I didn't. I decided it really wasn't for me. So,
but in any case, Professor Khalili moved on to earn a PhD in political science at Columbia University and produced earlier two important books, Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, which came out in 2007 with Cambridge University Press, and Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgency, which also came out in 2013, Stanford University. And of course, today we are going to talk about this wonderful, amazing book that I hope that I can get the picture on there. and we'll talk mostly about this book today. I really want to mention this, that in one of his last correspondences, somebody asked Engels, what is this dialectic that you talk about? And he said, simply dialectic is seeing things in motion.
wow.
And very simple definition. But I always thought that perhaps that was the most profound definition of dialectical seeing things in motion, seeing things in motion, meaning that when things move, they're always in the process of becoming. They're always in the process of making relations. They are always in the process of interconnectedness to other things that are in motion. And I have to say that whenever I read anything by Laleh Khalili, it reminds me of that notion of dialectics, and because truly one of the few scholars I know that is truly capable of situating the subject of her study in motion, and in motion both in historical terms, temporally and spatially, and the way in all three books, I would say that this is sort of to me, this is the prominent feature of all these three books, and the way they're connected to one another. Of course, substantively, I think also they're connected, but it's more kind of epistemologically, methodologically, that's how they're connected. That's seeing things, everything is in motion and generating relationships historically, ethnographically, politically, in terms of political economy. So for anyone who hasn't read these books, I highly recommend reading them. And then today, we're going to talk about the Sinews of War and trade. I just have to say that I enjoy tremendously reading this book. But I want to ask Professor Khalili to just tell us about the book, how it came about, and what are the main points that you raised in this book, and then we'll have a conversation about it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And thank you very much also for your very close and generous reading, but also for recognizing something that connects these three books of mine, because one of the things that I'm always terrified of people asking is what connects all of the different work you've done that seem to be so vastly different. But I also have to say this before I launch into a discussion of Sinews, is that you probably recognize this kind of emotion across time and space. And in part, I think it might be because of the way that both you and I went through a cataclysmic, transformative moment, which changed time and resulted in us changing place, changing space, the Iranian Revolution. And I think that in some ways that ends up getting written into the way that you read the world and into the way that you write the world. And so I think that that might actually be one way that this kind of a historical background, my own personal background, echoes through the work that I've done. In terms of Sinews, so I think I've talked a lot about how I came to do Sinews. It's a very different book than my previous books. Both previous books were really concerned about warfare. They were concerned about political violence. They were concerned about the ways in which people cope with, deal with, but also enact political violence against others, in particular in Time in the Shadows. And also about the way that ideas, personnel, practices, military doctrine moved across time and space. Sinews is a very different kind of book. It is much more concerned with political economy, and although it does have inevitably political violence as an adjunct, not only of trade, but also of the exploitation of the workers that are involved in the making of this political economy, although it does have that political violence at its center, it also looks at so much else that is not only encompassed, included in the discussion of war and violence. So some of the things that I was really interested in were connections across the sea. To me, it seemed like port cities were cities that looked outward, and that those connections across the seas, across multiple oceans, were ones that I really wanted to excavate. I grew up in a landlocked place. I grew up in the city of Mashhad in Iran, which is about 1,000 miles from the nearest open water, open sea. And 1,000 kilometers, I should say. And so I think that in a way, going to the sea and seeing the sea as a kind of a vector of movement was really interesting to me. And I really wanted to work with that. It also, Sinews also allowed me to shift my geographic lens a little bit. I was particularly interested in the way that power, social relations, economic relations, and war operated in the Arabian Peninsula. Up until that point, the focus of most of my work had really been in Israel-Palestine and in Lebanon. And so I was interested in those places in the Middle East from which at the moment power is emanating. And of course, the sets of social relations that are emerging out of the Arabian Peninsula are fascinating. And so I really wanted to work on that a little bit. I was also really concerned about the way that we have an amazing generation of younger scholars that are coming up and doing incredibly transformative work about the Arabian Peninsula. But there's a kind of mainstream sort of work that is being done about the peninsula, and particularly the richer Gulf countries, which tend to focus on a series of cliches. So either geopolitical forms of security, or politics of frontierism, or the sort of the aesthetics of bling. And having visited those places, I thought that there was a lot more stories to talk about than just those three things. Although, of course, there's much to be said about that aesthetics of bling in some places, but not in others. And I wanted to also say that I wanted to de-exceptionalize those Gulf countries. I wanted to de-exceptionalize the Arabian Peninsula. I wanted to show the way a place like Dubai is actually echoes another location like Singapore. And so some of the ways in which social relations, political relations, the economies operate in these places are not exceptional. They're not particularly strange or odd or exotic. They are in fact echoes of other instances of global trade, global social relations, global political economy. So those were important impetuses, the important intents when I started to work on this. But once I started working, there was just so much to do, so much to read, so much to write about. And a lot of that actually first came to me through novels and poetry written by the people from the peninsula. I think one of the biggest influences, inspirations for me was Abdurrahman Munif, the great Saudi / Syrian / Iraqi author, who his Cities of Salt quintet, only 3 of which have been translated into English, are absolutely stunning recountings of the history, at least of Saudi Arabia, but in many ways echoing what else goes on the peninsula. And so that inspiration was also always there in the back of my mind as I was writing the book.
That's wonderful. I like the way you situate all this story. If you don't mind, I just call it story because it is in a sense a very a gripping story of transformation of this region, and how through this transformation the region becomes connected to global capitalism, basically. And in that sense, I thought that this story is also inspired. I don't want to sort of make this crude reference there, but nevertheless, I'm going to make this reference that in a sort of an actor network kind of way, that it's about the sand, it's about the sea, it's about the people, and it's about how all these things are interacting with one another to form an all new political, social, economic order, and how that order is perpetuating itself.
Yeah. I think you put your finger on something that I want to connect to how we started this conversation. The materiality of stuff mattered to me, and that might be the engineer in me. But it also, but as you say, the materiality of the sand mattered to me. I wanted to know how things worked. So that also is probably the engineer in me. So I really wanted to know how dredging worked. I spent weeks reading dredging magazines and big technical documents about how to dredge and how to construct concrete. I read manuals on different grades of concrete that is used in the construction of ports. And then I also tried to train myself, and this was a lot harder actually, on how derivatives and options and other kinds of financial instruments worked. And so to some extent, I wanted to know the inner workings of some of the things that construct a port, because a port isn't just the space in which the ship arrives, it's loaded or unloaded. It's a whole bundle of things. It's not only the sort of the physical actual space of the port, or say the trucks that leave it with the goods that have arrived, or the roads or the rails, or all the physical things that we see, but it's also the bundle of laws, the accounting standards, the engineering standards, the kinds of regulations, the kinds of competition, the kinds of management expertise that goes into this. So that was really important to me. Another thing that was really important to me was that by focusing on the materiality of it, whether it was the water or the sand, I could do that motion thing. I could do the connection across the water. So if you're thinking about sand, surprisingly, and I talk about this both in this book and in several other talks I've given and an essay that I wrote for a magazine, interestingly, the sand from the Rub al-Khali, from the empty quarter in Saudi Arabia, cannot be used for making the concrete that is necessary, because it is a wind-blown, wind-eroded sand, which means it's fine and uniform, therefore it cannot be used. Then what goes into bringing the kind of sand you need to make concrete? And then an entire vista opens of trade in sand, for example. Or what about water? So to me, the roots were really interesting. And I here want to invoke a brilliant young scholar of the Indian Ocean, Fahad Bishara. He was one of the people that actually read my manuscript. And one of the things that he kept coming back to me as he was reading my manuscript in its early stages was to not forget the history of the connections, these Indian Ocean connections, or the legal regimes that existed, or the modes of commercial relation that existed before the sort of modern forms of capitalism and trade that we recognize, to acknowledge those connections and the way that this sort of modern system of imperial capitalism was grafted on top of this. Of course, Jairus Banerjee, a fabulously brilliant Indian scholar of capitalism, who also wants to sort of extend the history of capital backwards and talk about mercantile capital in the Indian Ocean, also does a lot of that work, both theoretically and historically. But to me, it was also really important to start at that moment before oil comes, to acknowledge that, for example, the trade that existed between the Arabian Peninsula or the coasts of the Gulf or the coasts of the Red Sea with the rest of the Indian Ocean, or the pilgrimage to Mecca via Jeddah, were also social relations that existed richly and continue to exist, and that they didn't become forgotten pasts surpassed by a kind of a modernist economy, but rather they infused together into this incredibly complex, accreted history that we see today.
That's so wonderful, and also, I mean, along the same lines, I really like the way that you in the book you look at the shore from the sea, and then you look at the sea from the shore, and then you are also in the sea, and in so many different ways. I thought that if I'm not mistaken, there is even a passage there that you are de-romanticizing everything there,
yeah.
you know, and I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, and this kind of de-romanticizing. It was sort of something that stayed with me in two different ways, you know, from the shore to the sea and sea to the shore.
So part of it is the sea is constantly invoked as the sublime. There are probably more maritime novels than there are any other, no other location, no other site becomes the site of writing of novels, which is of course the quintessential text of modernity, than the sea. The sea becomes the site of the sublime. You sort of encounter the sea and you think about it in as a kind of a representative or allegory for lots of other things, from God to philosophy to man to whatever else. And it is also an incredibly stunning space. It's particularly when you go out to the ocean, and the limitlessness, the horizonlessness of this is both terrifying and extraordinarily amazing. So there's an element of the sublime in there, which is inevitable. There's also an element of what a great US historian of technology has called the technological sublime, which is that when, and again, this is perhaps the engineer in me, but I don't think I'm the only one, that when you look at great technological sort of architectural engineering feats, there is an element of awe and fear in looking at that. And the modern ports often are that. There are these enormous cranes, the container terminals, the big, massive tankers that come through. They are all unbelievably stunning at some fundamental, both aesthetic, but also day-to-day level. These are works of technology that are that may have been unimaginable to our ancestors only a couple of generations back. And so I think that's kind of a cliched sense of newness of these things is also a form of sublime. But I also wanted to de-romanticize that. It's because while all of this looks stunning, there's also an underlying element of blood, of hard work, of violence, of dirt, of oil, and of the everyday and textured, of the sort of the small quotidian lives of all of those who have been fundamentally embedded in this. And of the tedium of it, actually. One of the things that is really, to me, interesting is the way that people who haven't been on board big ships tend to romanticize work aboard ships. Even somebody as absolutely mind-bogglingly brilliant as C.L.R. James, when writing about Moby Dick, talks about, you know, the great sort of international of workers that work aboard a ship. The thing is that historians will tell you that even when there were enough people aboard a ship to make that ship and a kind of an international of workers, the work was tedious and backbreaking and incredibly difficult. And that in part probably explains the emergence of the incredibly heavily disciplinary hierarchical systems that emerge as a way of managing the ship. And I think that in modern times, massive ships, about 10 times the size of the biggest ships of the 19th century, are now run by, I would say, sometimes a 10th, sometimes a 20th, 5% of the number of people who used to run the much smaller ships before. And therefore, you have a kind of a sense of emptiness in these ships, a sense of the machine being everywhere, but the humans being small and working unbelievably hard to do this. And so I think that I wanted to get at that hardness. Now, the other thing that I really wanted to do, and I think this was in part a result of sort of having been aboard ships in order to research this, was that I wanted to look at the shore through the eyes of the seafarers. And I was very lucky to be able to go on a couple of container ship trips. And aside from the fact that it is an amazing sort of wonderful way to travel, it's an amazing way to go to places. For example, I wouldn't have been able to visit Jeddah because I wouldn't have been able to get a visa, but I arrived into the city of Jeddah on board a ship. So that's, aside from those, what was amazing was the ability to speak to seafarers who'd been on the ship and who could tell you about different ports, who could tell you about the moments of arrival into these different spaces. You could tell you which ports they would look forward to visiting and which ones they dreaded. And the whole process, and in some instances, when some of these people had been working for 20 years, they could tell you about the change across the decades. And so I think that element of sort of looking at the port from the sea, looking at the way that people who worked the ships saw these ports and the way that their view changed over time was really interesting to me. And in part, it shaped my view. But there is a wonderful phrase that a historian of Indian Ocean, Michael Pearson, has used, which he says that histories of oceans need to be amphibian. They need to take account both of the sea and of the coast and of the land. And so I was hoping to do a little bit of that. To me, I try to bookend the book with the sea and the people who work the sea, and the land appears throughout that story as well.
That's again, I mean, the way you get this sense of how these colonial hierarchies are reproduced on the board of the ship, and of course now you know, I wasn't thinking about that when you mentioned that, you know, the number of people who work on these ships are radically reduced, but nevertheless, despite that reduction, you see the kind of reproduction of those colonial relations, and the question of race and nationality and all these things are so sort of ingrained in the way these labor relations on board the ships are maintained.
Yes, I think that that's enormously important. I think since since regulations have been reduced on maritime work, we see an emergence of a kind of a dual wage structure aboard the ships, where particularly ships that are flagged to Europe, where you see that in the officer ranks you have Eastern Europeans now. It used to be Western Europeans, but Eastern Europeans are now cheaper. And then you see among the crew people that are emerging out of the global south. So the Filipino sailors are still the most numerous, but they are fast being surpassed by Chinese seafarers in the ranks. And the contract structures, even in ships that are well regulated, between the difference in contract structures between the crew and the officers is incredibly stark, such that you see the officers have much shorter tenure on each round that they're on the ship, 4 months or something, and then they have a chance to get on to get back to land for about a month, whereas the crew, 9 months, they can spend 9 months at sea. And in fact, with COVID, where they have been unable to get off the ships, sometimes that 9-month duration has actually been extended to 15, 16 months. So there are people aboard these ships who haven't been home in a year and a half, in fact haven't been able to get off the ships, but for 24 hours here, 24 hours there, for a year and a half. And that, to me, also says something about these global inequalities. The condition of work is astonishing. But then the Arabian Peninsula is also particularly interesting because, like some of the other large city-states, Hong Kong or indeed Singapore, it is very reliant on migrant labor. And the migrant labor's presence in these ports is incredibly stark. And that, again, also is a way that these ports end up being a kind of a portal to seeing the deepening of the forms of inequality that emerge in global labor regimes, because they end up concentrating it, they end up showing it at its most kind of intense and pure in many of the countries of the Gulf.
Yeah, and again, this issue of jurisdiction over the seas, and one of the issues that keeps coming to mind when one reads the book is that you basically lose the ability to see the seas the same way that you used to see it. and you know, you constantly see these charts, these kind of divisions, both in terms of routes as well as what is at the bottom of the sea, and how these kind of forms of jurisdiction is worked out via these kind of international legal institutions, and of course, you know, you see that again exactly the same way that the World Bank works or the IMF works. This kind of sea jurisdiction has a very sort of particular way of being administered.
Yes, I think it's one of the things that has become clear to me, even in the aftermath, especially in the aftermath of having written the book, is to the extent to which fiction and fantasy end up being actually the operating kind of scaffolding or the undergirding of so much of the regimes of law, labor, and capital accumulation that actually works in the sea. And one of these fictions is the fiction of jurisdiction. It's the transformation of a physical, geophysical feature, such as the sea or the undersea continental shelf, into, for example, a legal category. And the moment that this transformation happens, it's the kind of an alchemy. It really is a little bit of magic. And it requires a certain degree of belief in a kind of, as I said, a fiction, a kind of a fantasy. The fantasy is that coasts and the sea are constant and non-dynamic and stable. And therefore, they can be easily divided up. And they can easily be divided up according to some set of regulations that have been arrived at during the high time of the sort of the imperial period in the early 20th century, and which can be extended otherwise. And what is astonishing about this, of course, is that it is not true. I mean, we kind of, we look at the maps of coastlines and are deeply unaware that these maps shift on a day-to-day basis, that the borders, the coastline changes every day with erosion, with currents, with winds.
Particularly now with this, with the climate change that we see, that's a kind of rapid movement of change there.
Yeah, it's transforming at unbelievable speed. And then in other places, we see these coastlines being extended through these massive geoengineering, terraforming practices, such as land reclamation. And so these coastlines change. So that's the first fiction, fantasy that is in operation. But the second is that somehow these areas, which are actually overlapping and quite difficult to parse out, can be divided. But of course, that fiction has been imposed on these seas. And in part, it has been imposed because there are so many rich undersea resources that first, the countries of the global north, and now the corporations, primarily based in the global north, but of course now extending also to places where capital is accumulating at faster rates, such as China or Dubai or whatever. And you're seeing these corporations wanting access to these goods and wanting a set of sort of legal contracts that allows them access to these goods. And so I try to trace that history from the late 1940s onwards. Actually, the history goes a little bit further back, but I'm specifically interested in the sort of the debates around continental shelf. And I talk about how these debates over continental shelf actually end up being really fascinating, but also very odd works that everybody buying into the same fiction and pretending that these kinds of fantasies that they have is real, so that they can arrive at a kind of a legal solution which will give the absolute highest advantage possible to the corporations at the time based in Europe and North America. And so, and then also around this, what you see emerging is an entire legal apparatus which begins showing up during the process, the process of decolonization, and with nationalization of the natural resources of a lot of decolonizing countries. You see these apparatuses emerging. World Bank, for example, setting up a state foreign investor dispute resolution mechanisms, which end up always ruling against the newly independent states and always ruling for the corporations. Now some of these companies are based outside of the global north, outside of Europe and North America. But at the time that these mechanisms were invented, this was essentially another form of reinstituting sort of neocolonial mechanisms of the countries that had just lost their colonies.
No, so true. I remember when I was a child, like many other children, I would say around the world, reading Jules Verne and being fascinated by these possibilities under the sea and all these things. And then, then there comes this kind of juridical understanding of, dividing the resources. And it always reminds me of in the Club of Rome on Limits to Growth in early 1960s already, people were talking about extraterrestrial mining,
Yeah.
And of course, the sea already is that territory that has already happened. And perhaps, your next book, you can go to the space and see how that extraterrestrial mining would unfold.
I have to tell a story about this because I haven't included it in the book because it doesn't happen within the geographic area that I was trying to focus on, but it is, to me, absolutely fascinating. So in the 1970s, there's this push towards coming up with some international treaty in order to sort of come to some sort of an agreement about undersea, deep sea mining, particularly of manganese nodules. And the reason a number of international conferences happen. And the reason that they start happening is because many of the countries of the global south, some of them newly decolonized, are really worried about the US coming up with these incredibly deep sea mining ships that were going to, for example, go and harvest these manganese nodules at the bottom of the sea. So that in itself is a fascinating narrative about global inequalities. But what is actually even more, this is Jules Verne level weirdness, is that in fact, those deep sea sort of mining ships that the US was using were in fact not looking for manganese nodules. They were looking for a sunken Soviet nuclear submarine with nuclear missiles in the Pacific Ocean. And they were trying to find that sunken submarine before the Soviets did, so that they could get to the technology. And they managed to get some bits of it, actually. But to me, that is,
so
you know, we didn't find out about this till years later. But to me, that's absolutely fascinating that somehow, again, this is another fiction that is at the root of a series of conferences that are supposed to be about deciding the fate of undersea mining. And fascinating and incredibly useful conferences. And they're actually being discussed again, because those ideas about deep sea mining are now much more current in the technologies there. But it was really also about this Cold War competition over submarines, over nuclear submarines. And to me, this kind of element of intrigue, kind of ordinary political economy, global imperial or neo-imperial divisions, and, you know, the Cold War rivalries is just absolutely fascinating. Jules Verne couldn't write this if he wanted to.
No, I mean, it's pretty wild for even the wildest imagination.
It really is. It really is.
But it's so true. And you know, also, you know, and a related topic that it's so amazing to read your book at this moment, that that there is so much hype about high technology and not kind of an understanding of how much of the world trade and by extension wars are still depend on this kind of very if one can call it dirty ways of transportation, and something like 85-90% of the world trade happens on these ships and all those things that I would imagine a great majority of people think that those things are things of the past, and especially now, you know, we sit in front of our computer, we click a button, and we get whatever we order, it comes, and it basically hides all these relationships and trades and things that goes behind the scenes to bring that to our homes. And I think this is such a timely book in that sense as well.
Thank you.
To go and think about this, that we still continue to rely on these networks that were mostly put in place in the mid 20th century, or from the early 20th century, but, you know, pretty much firmly in place in mid 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting, because if we look at global trade as being this kind of palimpsest of different kinds of inventions that have happened throughout, I'm going back actually hundreds of years, but particularly in the 20th century, if looking at, for example, the roots of e-commerce, some of the things that are happening are not, as you say, the kind of a virtual thing where you click and something is at your door. I mean, one of the things that there's a wonderful researcher, journalist in New York called Ingrid Burrington. And one of the things that she has done, and she's done an amazing job of opening my eyes to this, is to think about data centers. So even the click that we do, the sort of working from home virtual work that we do, is deeply dependent on really big materials structures, the data centers, the cables that have been laid, the kind of eminent domain that had to be claimed in order for those cables to be laid across public or private land. And the electricity that goes into these data centers. There's another geographer, Trevor Paglen, who's written about sort of these, what he calls blank spaces on the map. And he's writing about things that tend to be obscured. So, for example, the secret bits of the US budget, how we can find those. But one of the things that he's also really interested in is how intelligence gathering happens under the sea. And of course, the internet that we all use in order for us to actually access the information that is in some parts of the world, this is not virtual. It doesn't happen via satellite it actually probably more likely happens via undersea cables. So the materiality of that is incredibly significant. And of course, those undersea cables follow the routes of the radio cables of the 1930s, and those follow the routes of the telegraph cables of the late 19th century. So there is a kind of, as I said, a palimpsest of history. The ships that arrive have changed radically, but many of the routes are still very similar routes, although now we see more routes coming out of China. But interestingly, for example, one of the things that to me is also another interesting statistic is that, that there was a graph of all of the different states in the United States and what the number one occupation was. I think one of the US, maybe the Department of Labor, had produced the sets of statistics used here. And in the vast majority, I think maybe even more than 40 of the states, the number one occupation was delivery driver, logistics driver. Which again, that is like the e-commerce that we think is not blood and mortar. It's not concrete and mortar. It's not brick and mortar. Is in fact, it is. There's a guy in his car driving around delivering your goods, which was probably brought over from China into Los Angeles or Long Beach, put on the back of a truck of an exploited worker that is not allowed to unionize, and then shipped across the country to go to distribution centers and other places. And that materiality is, to me, fascinating, and I really wanted to get at that in writing about the story that I write about.
Yeah. So this is so fascinating. There's so many different interesting issues to talk about. But since you mentioned China a number of times, let's sort of bring in China into the story a little bit. And some years ago, the late Giovanni Arrighi told me that you do know that all the fuss about Iran is about China, and I thought that this was such an interesting take, that this is all about the formation of these new relationships, emergence of a new political economy of China in the world, and the connection that China is forging with oil-producing countries, and trying to expand the sphere of its influence in different port cities, and particularly in the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, and so on and so forth. So how do we make sense of China here now? So is it... okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
When you mentioned China, the name that went through my head was Giovanni Arrighi. And so I have just recently been reading him, actually. And in part, that's, I think, why his 20th century book. And it was, to me, interesting, because one of the things that he argues is that we see this kind of a rise of the US as the global empire, and the US takes the place of Britain, and Britain had taken the place of the Dutch, and the Dutch the Genoese, and then what happens next? And of course it is China, because we do see the same sort of processes that he talks about in a kind of a broad brush, but they are the argument is incredibly compelling, is that you go through these cyclical periods of financialization, and once the financialization happens, it sort of leads to a handing over, kind of a commodity capitalism to the next great sort of global empire, and I think, or global age, if you want to call it. And so I think that because I've been reading him so recently, I think that was really fresh in my mind. Now, to me, it's also fascinating because, of course, it is impossible to write about maritime without writing about China. And as part of my research, I ended up having to go to Hong Kong to try to talk to financiers and ship owners and things like that. And to me, what is also interesting is that some of the things that China is doing, not only about, for example, the securing of energy resources in the Arabian Peninsula, but also the securing of raw materials from particularly throughout Africa, but particularly in East Africa, and some of the things that it does in doing so echo, perhaps not in such a coercive way as the 19th century forms of empire, but some of those elements. So the building of infrastructure to transport the goods from the location of the production of raw materials to the ports. There was a time in the 1960s, in the era of decolonization, 1960s and 70s, perhaps even into the 80s, where China actually sent its engineers and experts to a lot of the newly decolonizing places to help them build roads and railroads. And those roads and railroads, their paths and their routes didn't echo the old colonial paths, which was from the centers of production of raw materials to the coast. Those were the kind of thing that Walter Rodney and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa talks about as being the kind of railroad that Africans needed in order to go and visit their friends. So between different population centers intended for their transportation rather than for the extraction of goods. So the Tanzania Liberation Railway, I think that's the name of it, about which there's a really great book by Jamie Monson, is an echo of that early sort of decolonizing story. There are roads that were built, and I mentioned a short story about one of these roads being built by the Chinese between Sana'a and the coast, and Sana'a and the coast in Yemen, which is also another story. But I think that as China has become a kind of a global powerhouse and a global space of production, some of the things it does, it is looking for securing natural resources, including petroleum and natural gas. It is, and of course, other forms of fossil fuel. It imports enormous amounts of coal from Australia, for example, but also other natural resources, everything from uranium and copper to bauxite and iron ore. And also to expand its markets in these places. Now, what was very distinctive about the imperial forms that the Europeans used, and then of course the US did, was how closely those forms of trade and extraction of materials and the use of markets went hand in hand with colonial conquest. And what would be interesting to see would be the extent to which that scenario is replayed into the future with the Chinese or not. I mean, to the extent to which the Chinese will combine their trades overseas with kind of a military push would be what would be really interesting to see. And I think we see elements of that in some places. For example, they have a base in Djibouti. Why? Other than to protect their interests in East Africa. They, for example, use one of the big Chinese logistics companies that is involved in these kinds of mining extraction, uses Eric Prince, famously of Blackwater, to provide security to them. So there are these elements that we see, which is fascinating. And then, of course, if you go to Pakistan, there's the story of CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistani Economic Corridor, which is being built, which elements of it are being built in areas which are under heavy contestation, counterinsurgency, violence by the Pakistani state, particularly in Baluchistan. And so, to me, the fact that there are echoes here of past forms of power inequalities, which I find fascinating. Now, when it comes to China and Iran, what has been interesting is that the development of the Chabahar port, which is supposed to be a competitor to Gwadar, where the Chinese, it's the terminus of the CPEC thing, Chabahar is actually being developed by the Indians. So what we're seeing is the emergence of new forms of regional rivalry as well, which with the shooting at the Chinese-Indian border yesterday or the day before, this is actually interesting and worrying. So we are stepping into a new era, and maybe Giovanni Arrighi was the person who managed to see it long before everybody else.
Was up to something. You know?
Yes, he definitely was up to something.
Yeah. And I've taken enough of your time. I just wanted to ask one last question, which is rather a predictable question. There is what's happening in Iran in this story? And I mean, there is not much of Iran in the book, and I wonder if this is because of lack of access, or because when you describe the different nodes of building port cities, port towns, there are geological concerns, there is depth of sea issue, there is geopolitical concerns. Why we don't see that kind of development on the Iranian coast? I mean, what's happening there that makes Iran of course, if you think about Iran as the gendarme of the Middle East during the Shah before the revolution, one would expect to see much more kind of heavy investment there, but we don't see it. Why is that?
So I don't want to be an interloper here because I'm not a very good historian of Iran, but I would venture to guess a few things. One, that although Iran does have a kind of a maritime history, that maritime history goes back something like far in sort of forgotten past. So it doesn't have a maritime presence the way, for example, Kuwait did or Oman did in the 19th century. Bushehr was never the kind of seafaring city that Kuwait was, where maritime nakhodas ended up going out, the captains ended up going out to places. So to me, that's one thing. So that kind of a 19th century history, the sort of the layer underneath that would hold these things up didn't exist. When Iran developed a sort of a big oil tanker terminal, that was in Abadan, and of course it did so under the auspices of, as a private oil terminal, as under the auspices of Anglo-Persian, later Anglo-Iranian oil company. And once that was nationalized, that ended up becoming not as significant as sort of an oil port as some of the other ports across the water. In fact, the British moved, they set up two big refineries, one in Kuwait and one in Aden, to sort of take the work that they had take the oil that they'd been sending. So that is also significant other things. Geologically, Iran should be great because Chabahar, for example, is on a coast that would be fantastic for setting up a kind of a nice sheltered harbor. But that investment has not been done. And the only thing that I can say is that is perhaps because of the sanctions. Sanctions have made trade with Iran incredibly difficult. The sanctions have stunted a lot of the processes that could have potentially allowed for the flourishing of ports on the southern coast of Iran. There were histories of this is Caspian trade with Soviet Union, although that has also massively abated. But my sense is that what has been very significant has been the punishment that has been wreaked against Iran since 1979 and to various degrees of intensity by the global powers, foremost among them the US and Britain. And that punishment has translated into not being able to sort of keep up with their neighbors across the sea in developing these ports. There hasn't been any investment coming, and you know what, even if the investment came, what trade? You know, there are overland routes that are well developed, and so perhaps that is why that oceanic trade has not been so significant as it should and could have been.
Okay, thank you so much, Laleh
My
Khalili.
pleasure.
This was such a wonderful conversation, and I have to tell you that this is not going to take the place of inviting you to Princeton, and
I hope
hopefully soon we'll have you here in person. And the book again is Sinews of War and Trade. Grab your copy and read it. Thank you so much, Laleh.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such an enjoyable conversation, Behruz Shah.
Thank you.
All right.
Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.